The X-Men were created in 1963 or thereabout. I worked with Jack Kirby, and Jack was, to my mind, the best artist you could find to do superhero comics. And when I told Jack about the X-Men, he sparked to the idea. He loved it. He drew the characters magnificently, I think, and we were off and running. My biggest problem was, how do they get their superpowers? Well, I couldn't have everybody bitten by radioactive spiders or hit by gamma rays like the Hulk or whatever. And I took the lazy way out. It suddenly occurred to me, if I could say that people are mutants, I need no further explanation. Actually, in the beginning, I was going to call them the mutants. That was the original name I had. But my then publisher didn't like the name. I said, why? He said, Stan, nobody is going to know what mutants are. So I said, okay, and I went back and thought, and I figured Professor Xavier, extra power. So I went back and I said, let's call them the X-Men. He said, okay, that's fine. And to this day, I can't understand why he felt if people won't know what mutants are, they would know what an X-Man is.
They grew out of 50s movies, like a lot of comics back then. The idea of the mutant menace, the idea of Children of the Damned. Also an element of the McCarthyism, the McCarthy era, that there was this enemy within. The key to the X-Men has from the start been that they were feared and hated by the world they were sworn to protect.
That was the underlying philosophy behind it, that to try to show the reader the irony and the fallacy of being against the very people who have the ability to help you and are trying to do something good.
1963, 64, 65 was not the time that people were interested in reading the adventures of misfits.
Apparently, without Jack's artwork, some of the readers started slackening off, and therefore the sales slumped for a while.
The problem was our marketing was such that we didn't find out about the sales until the final numbers on the sales till 10 months after publication. By then, the decision had been made to kill the book. So we didn't know that it was actually going up until it was too late, which is why they brought it back as a reprint, to see if we could sustain the interest and then figure out what to do next. So then it became a matter of the right time, the right place, the right creative team, which in Len and Dave Cockrum, and then Dave Cockrum and me, thankfully, they found.
Chris Claremont took over, and somehow the stories became very complex. A lot more characters were introduced.
The idea of having strong, dynamic women characters at that point in the comics medium was very rare. And the idea of having a major black character at that point was very rare. Women then were basically defined as girlfriends, or the girls who got into trouble. Very rarely did you find one that's capable of holding the center of a book all by themselves. It struck a very real chord. Wolverine is what every adolescent wants to be. Strong, sure of himself, a sense of honor, a defined moral code. I know what's right, I know what's wrong, I won't take any bull from anybody, and I have the moxie, the ability, the strength of character and body to pull it off.
Glenn Wein created him. One of the things I think people like about him is he's not a good guy. He's not a goody-good guy. This fella's rough and bad-tempered and he's mean, but you know that underneath it all, he's got a good heart, and if there's a problem, you'd want him on your side.
It all sort of fell into place during a very long and memorable car ride from San Diego to Los Angeles, stuck in traffic on the interstate with myself and the artist Frank Miller. I was trying to pitch him the Wolverine miniseries that Marvel wanted us to do, and Frank was reluctant because to him, Wolverine had was basically just a two-dimensional berserker, a guy with claws who went crazy and cut everything up, and he wasn't interested in that. So we began talking about character, who I thought he was, who Frank thought he was, what kind of person we felt he was. And it was one of those rare occasions where a story grew out of who the main character was, rather than a sequence of events that defined the character. The character, in this case, defined the events. And the more we discussed it, the more simpatico we became, the more he sort of refined into focus. Wolverine refined into focus. And what we came up with was ultimately the idea that he's a failed samurai, that he has this ideal of self. It is pure, it is absolute, it is unreachable. And the tragedy is, he's there, pretty much. He just can never accept it. He always thinks it's one step further. Everyone around him, you know, guy, you're it, you're there. You are this person. No, I'm not this person.
The X-Men, of course, has spawned games, interactive games, videos, an animated cartoon, and toys, and clothes, T-shirts, and you name it, and there have been X-Men them.
We're not what you think.
Welcome, Professor.
I've been heavily involved with X-Men since 1990, trying to get it on television. And finally in 1992, we got it on Fox Kids. And through this time, we obviously wanted to make the movie.
There have been people interested in doing an X-Men movie for a long time. They never could come up with the right story, the right approach, and having been burnt a number of times in the past by allowing people to do movie versions of our characters that were less than profound, we were very particular.
I know I was part of the initial discussions that we had back in 89 and 90 with James Cameron and Lightstorm when they were going to produce the X-Men and for Carolco. And we were going full steam ahead with that. And we had meetings, Larry Kazanov and Cameron and Stan and I, and we all sat down and we talked about it. And then Cameron got caught up in doing Spider-Man, and Carolco just went up in smoke. The movie's a totally different animal in the comics. I mean, in the same way it'd be a totally different animal if they were adapting a book. You have a whole different set of opportunities, and you have to redefine it in terms that make sense for the movie. Brightly colored spandex skin-tight costumes in a comic look great because they're pictures. You put them on real people and it's like, ugh.
These kind of pictures needed the kind of technology that is available today. And the other thing that made it all possible, that my universe, which are so-called geeks, today are the filmmakers, the writers, the producers.
About 6 years ago, Scott Nimmerfro, who was a development person at our company, brought the idea of making X-Men into a movie to me. And I confess I knew of it, certainly, but I hadn't read it, any of the issues. So he gave me a couple issues, and he gave me a background of all the characters. And the first character I read about was Logan, Wolverine. And he was a tragic hero. And I got really caught up in his whole history. I felt he was psychologically complex. And I started reading the other characters, and I called up Scott and I said, absolutely, we're making this movie.
The future is here.
Actually, it started with, I put a call to Peter Rice. Peter had sent Brian the script for Alien 4. Peter just wanted Brian to know, this was right after Usual Suspects, that Fox was thanking him for these larger projects. And I asked Peter, what about X-Men? And at the time, another director was attached. And I saw Peter a few months later, and the other director had dropped out. And eventually, by that summer, Peter had agreed to let me come up with my own story and take on the project. It was funny. At first, Brian said he would never. I remember approaching him with the concept, and I think his first reaction is the way most people react at first. is a comic book movie. I'm not interested in that or seeing that or working on that.
I had never really read comics as a kid, but I was a great fan of science fiction and fantasy, literature and movies. And when he presented it to me, I thought, a comic book? I don't know. And I started to examine the materials and look into the characters' histories.
Once you get past that initial baggage, you see that it's really a great story, and that's what Brian saw.
It's the magic of science fiction and fantasy. It lets us look at the human condition, tell a normal human story, but from a completely different perspective. And I think this was sort of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's way of commenting on prejudice in their own colorful way, in the way that plays like The Crucible. This is sort of the comic book version of The Crucible. And it grew because I think that ideology is very strong, and I also think that every young person, even if whether you're in a minority or you're not, any young person at some point in their life feels different. They feel strange. They feel like they don't belong. And they dream of going to a special place where they could be taken care of and loved for who or whatever they are.
There's not many people that'll understand what you're going through. But I think this guy Xavier's one of them. He seems to genuinely want to help you, and that's a rare thing. For people like us.
Brian and I had a discussion or two in the very beginning when we were starting the project, and the thing I like about Brian, I like many things about him, but is he brings an intelligence to a movie. He's not just an action director or just a special effects expert, but he knows characterization.
I consulted him on numerous occasions during the script development stage. I really wanted to feel his support and his approval of what we were doing and the world we were creating and how we were celebrating this thing he cut loose. I wanted it to be a strange introductory movie of a wonderful, fantastic, and historically beloved world.
I would liken this movie more to the beginning of the first Superman, where they were telling the tale of young Superman growing up and Glenn Ford, his father, and it was more of a narrative story. Our movie X-Men is unique in that respect. It isn't big and over the top. It is very grounded in terms of character, and the story is not overly fantastic and not overly comic booky. It is easy for the audience to relate to it.
This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
What Bryan Singer is doing is redefining the X-Men for a different audience, a much broader audience, an audience that is both more and less sophisticated. It doesn't know the minutiae of the X-Men canon. So what? If this movie can't tell them everything they need to know within those 2 hours, as any movie can, it won't matter.
If no one is equipped to oppose them, humanity's days could be over.
But if it can convey that, if you do come out of there after it's over with a sense of who these characters are, caring about them, caring about the conflict, wanting to see what happens next, that's perfect. That's exactly what it needs.
The great thing about X-Men, and I think Fox realizes this, is that it's a franchise. 100 different stories you can tell on these characters.
X-Men's also a world that appeals to people of all ages, as a following that's started in 1963.
X-Men stood the test of time and bad managements and bad Marvels and you name it. The characters, the franchise is bigger than the people who handled or mishandled it. So it was an awesome responsibility, and I'm ecstatic.
A lot of people have asked me what's the secret behind the X-Men's longevity. And I think it may be that there are so many characters and they've been so clearly defined, so well fleshed out,